This is Season 14, Episode 12 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Sandbox versus Narrative Campaigns, or We Go Thataway. Welcome to Mastering the RPG, like I said, a tabletop RPG podcast. All about upping your game, ideas, cool stuff found. An email when you get one, and we get one today, so that's great. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and Chris. You can find information about the show at masteringtherpg.com. That's all one word. And send us an email with feedback or questions at gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. So again, how's it going, guys? Good to have you back on the mic after a couple of weeks. How's it going? Eric, how's it going, man?
It's going okay. Gaming still running my game. We had some, cancellations that kind of disrupt stuff, but they're really, very apropos to this episode. They're about to move into the almost true open world kind of section of the game. We'll talk about that later. So that's going to be very exciting once they kind of see all the stuff in front of them. Yeah.
Well, it's cool. This will be apropos if you learn something yourself. That'd be great. So, Chris, how about you? How you been since we last talked?
I think since we last talked, I was doing the Foundry store, and that is actually out now. So my mental acuity is slowly returning from my late nights and extra work. I think I've played one game since then too, which was a Dungeon Crawl Classics game that went pretty well. We like that crazy system. But overall, pretty good. I'm slowly getting my brain back where it needs to be.
Well, I bought the science fiction companion through the store, and it worked out pretty seamlessly. So you guys did a good job. Nicely done.
Fantastic.
I'm doing all right myself. We're running a game. We still haven't quite, started. We've done a lot of world building, a lot of character creation for the new campaign. I have an adventure ready to rock and roll, but just didn't get a chance to run it yet. So hopefully we'll be.
And we started. You almost had a total party kill, but you pulled it back.
Well, that's true. They had to. We had our first kind of adventures where those guys getting out of their out of the brig on the ship and killing everybody that they had to kill. So I guess that counts as an adventure. I just kind of thought that more of the prelude for you guys just getting it together and getting a ship. And but yeah, that was very interesting. I don't know if I held back, but I could have put a lot more people on that ship. I could have had a lot more raiders.
Yeah, you definitely saw that. Like, if I let this go anymore, this will be bad. I think it's also because we're coming from Savage Pathfinder, where it was like every single time we were just wiping the floor with what you put on. Because we're like Savage Pathfinder characters are so powerful that it was like, oh shit, they're about to get. I'm gonna hold these guys. These guys give up. It was a good call. It was a good call because we were And the weapons in the Savage and Science Fiction Companion are a little more powerful too. So running around without armor can be a bad thing. So so that was actually fun, and I'm looking forward to having that go further. So very cool. All right, well, awesome. So cool news tonight. We do have an email. We have cool stuff found, and we have our main topic. So we've got a lot of great content. We'll get right to it, and we'll start with email. All right, have an email from Donald this week, and the question goes, could the cast please talk about a favorite published adventure and how they made it better? For example, I recently ran Deadlands Showdown at Sundown. I eliminated all the Twilight Legion hand-holding. The characters were brothers, and the eldest brother had gone to Sundown to meet Silas on a business venture. Now he was missing, and the characters had to investigate. Just as they were figuring it out, a rival faction, an evil witch that wanted the deck. The Silas were I can't read tonight. Wanted the deck. The Silas were filling with souls. Came to claim the card deck. Thanks for all you do, or thanks for all the work you guys put in. I get a lot from the podcast and the Savage Worlds content on Tabletop Tango. All right, sorry I butchered your email, but that's a great question. It's always interesting to learn what people think is good, bad, and different. For me, I'll just start out. For me, I don't run a lot of published adventures. I think the closest I really have come recently is I ran a Deadlands campaign, Lost Colony, and so I used the plot point campaign from the setting book. But I completely kind of ripped and tore it apart. I didn't follow the laid out formula of the adventures. I used the themes, the basics, the story elements, and then basically a lot of the character information and what the characters did would drive the kind of the narrative. So it's hard to say that that's my favorite adventure. It just happens to be one that I've run recently because, of course, the greatest adventure of all time is Keep on the Borderlands. No? Okay. Nobody agrees with me. All right. Got it. So what about you guys?
And the question is how you made it better. So for that, it was really about you incorporating more of the character stuff, right? And letting that lead.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I guess I kind of glossed over that. It really was about taking the characters' interests and how they were driving the story. Like, for example, Eric had a rival that was completely nothing to do with what would have been in the plot point campaign, but we weaved them in as part of what was going on and part of the story. I guess the hard part with published adventures is how railroady they are. You have to be careful to rip that bandage off and make them less so that the players don't feel like they had a hand in what the story was about as it goes. Good point, Eric. Thank you.
I'll skip. I'll be very quick because I do not run published adventures. It's just something that I never took to. I've definitely I'm trying to think if I ever even did a one shot that was a published adventure. I don't think so. I think I've been inspired from published stuff. So I'll say that my favorite published, and I don't even play in that many either. Most games I play in are usually homebrew or like Carl, kind of just influenced. But I would think Necessary Evil probably is one of my favorite published adventures, and Necessary Evil 2 as well. And the ways to make those better is kind of the same thing as to take breaks, even more so than just incorporating character ones. Character backstories kind of into the narrative. Those ones are really kind of stronger when you take breaks between the published stuff and just do totally separate adventures that have to do with the characters. And I got really into that as a player, I guess. So that would be my only thing is Necessary Evil 2. Chris, I know you have a lot on this.
I do. And I mentioned that I really liked Lost Mine of Phandelver, but now that I hear this email again, I think the best pre-made adventure that I've altered is Ghosts of Saltmarsh. Well, and that is more like a loose collection of scenarios that are in the same region, but it has these huge level gaps where you have nothing to do. And I made a big Yuan-Ti Serpent Folk trilogy that fit into it. So that one was very nice too, because it had a little hub city and a lot of kind of details around it that you can build off of. So that one I think would be my favorite that augment on my own.
Very cool. Very cool. I didn't realize that particular published adventure had a big gap in levels that the game master had to kind of fill in and do their own thing.
Yeah.
So, interesting.
There's one for level 1, 2, 3, and 4, but then there's nothing for 5, and it brings you back at 6, and then it happens again 2 more times like that, something like that.
Interesting. Cool. Well, Donald, I hope that at least answers the question. Sorry we don't have as much experience with the published adventures. Some of us don't. But, ripping apart, making them something our own, apparently is something that we've all done. So, great. So let's get on to the next topic, which is some cool stuff found. We have cool stuff found. Do you copy? Cool stuff found. Over. Eric, you are the champion of something cool that you found. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so this is my cool stuff. This is definitely not a direct gaming product, but I think it's useful for that. So it's from Gladden Design. They have this series of products called paper apps. Some of the apps, which basically they're all these little, I'm going to show on the screen. You guys, maybe we'll have a link, but they're these little ring notebooks. What would you say Carl, you're a nerd. What is this is a specific type of...
Well, it's a notebook like the police put in their pockets or an engineer
there you go.
put in their
like
pockets.
A little detective.
Yeah.
Whatever the inches they're all the kind of this size, and they are meant to emulate like a phone app, right? They have 3 gaming ones. So this is their little sci-fi game one, and you can see there's rules and there's little challenges. There's a dungeon crawling one and there's a golf one. But that's not what I'm talking about. Now, a lot of them use a dice. They also sell these little dice pencils. So they're little pencils that you can roll They have like a D6 on them, which is really cool. But the two products that I'm talking about that I find very helpful for games, one for game mastering, one for game mastering or players in IRL, are these two ones. So we'll start with the one that's called the To Do app. And this one is kind of a gamified productivity app, basically. I think it is. Besides, I have ADHD, so I look for tools like this to help me with stuff. I think this is very, very useful for game masters. When you, I think it's most useful for people doing creative work, and obviously some of that is game mastering and prepping. Basically, there is each page has a little 6 slots to put like tasks in. And then below there's like amount of time that's also related to a D6. So you fill in like 6 tasks. And then so you roll your die, and then whatever the die lands on, that's what you kind of do. And then you roll the die again to see how much time that you spend on that task. It is very, very, very useful for creative stuff that kind of is more open-ended. So if something is a game master, you can do stuff like, put in, okay, I need to work on the main hub city, right? Like Chris said, like I need to fill out the main hub city. Another one you might put is like, okay, let's work on like some character quests or something. Another one is like, let me make like some random comment maps just to have, like stuff like that, right? Which is not necessarily something that's like, doing the laundry that is just like a task you need to finish. This one might have variable times. So I find it very useful in keeping myself motivated for like hours to like work on stuff. And you roll, and then you kind of roll the time that you work on it, and then I will usually fill in like a little line and do like half, and then if I do it again, it's like I fill in the full circle, and then I'm kind of done on that task. So it really, really helps, at least for me, for prepping for game mastering stuff. So that's that product. The other one is what they call Notes. And this is useful for game masters. I also find this very useful for players. And this will be interesting to you, Carl, something that we happen in our own game, but very useful for IRL. Basically, it's just a little notebook. They're all the same size, like I said. But this one has all different types of, I don't know what you'd call this, formats. So there's like a hex one. There's triangle shapes. There's task ones. There's normal line. There's normal line ones, and there's also like a
so different grids, different types of grids.
Different grid types like that. Right. So it's really useful for game masters to write different types of notes or to like pre-plan out little maps. Like you could just fit this in your pocket, right? So you could like prep little maps very quickly on this or ideas for certain things. When we were doing our last game, Carl, and you had this whole like, it was kind of theater of the mind, but we had to track this kind of expanse, right? And I was using just a piece of paper and it wasn't working. If I had this at the time, it would have been very useful because I could have exactly mapped everything out, right? So I think this is very, very handy for play. I actually use this now for game notes. And it'd be very, very handy for players and stuff to do just different kind of notes, right? Like you can have your just general notes on the normal blank or the normal lines. You could map out stuff if you need to with this. You can have like your quests and the kind of filling in or different tasks or like spells or items that you want to look at. It's just really useful for like a variety of things. So again, they are not specific game products, but I have found them very, very useful for gaming. So that's the Gladden Design paper apps. Go check them out. They're a really cool company.
Okay, and we'll make sure Eric gets me a link to that, and we'll put that in the show notes so everybody can find Gladden paper apps. Cool. That is very cool. Eric was showing us on the screen as he was going through them, and there was a lot of interesting grid types that you could map things out. You could have different like layers of hell, and one you're mapping out into triangles, one is hex, it'd be all sorts of cool different stuff that you could do there.
And the D6 pencil fits really neatly in, right, like that. So it's just really useful for on-the-go game mastering and players.
The triangle ones are for isometric maps. That's the triangle display you guys are seeing. But I want one of these notebooks now that has every question I should ask in a room that I'm investigating during the game. So I just turn it to a new page, and I say, where are the obvious exits? Where is, and I go through, and I will be an investigator every time.
Yeah, it would be good to roleplay with an investigator to make yourself more in that mindset.
and that could help out those junior detectives that you see on TV that are just the rookies. Well, I'll pull out my notebook and I have it all figured out. So there you go. All right, well, awesome. That's a cool little product, and I like that it's not a gaming product, but it's something that definitely can help us with their game, and so that's pretty cool. So all right, everybody, what do you say we hit the main topic?
right, welcome to the main topic. Again, we're talking about the difference between sandbox and narrative campaigns and how they run and what's the difference between them. A little bit different today because this is a comparison. So we'll have some tips and tricks as always, but it's kind of compare and contrast more than just necessarily here's a problem we're trying to solve. So I'll be your host and walk everybody through it. So I think the first thing we should get to, obviously, is what's the difference. And this has got a lot of. I think there's a lot of people have different ideas. So these will be our ideas. What's a sandbox adventure or campaign, and what's a narrative campaign? What are those? What is those words defined as? I'm gonna kick it to Chris for this one first. What does a sandbox mean? What does that
Sandbox, despite what my brain tells me, means it is open worlded, like you can go many places. I always think of as a sandbox like, oh, it has 4 sides, so I'm contained in this little area. But it means the opposite of that. So that is a much broader kind of follow the choices, go where you want, take things at your pace or your direction, as opposed to the other narrative-driven one, which are you're following either a linear story or a set of beats or plot points to kind of get to an end that's been mostly, the path has been mostly predefined.
So Eric, what are your... You got some things to add on that one?
I mean, that sounds like a good overview. I would say this is kind of jumping the gun a little bit. I think we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but I think it's important to talk about here. I think most campaigns are different percentages of each of these. I think that's the most important thing to describe. Like there's no really a true, like an entirely true sandbox. In my mind is more of a, thought experiment or like the lab, right? Like the laboratory, like in a vacuum kind of thing. Same with narrative. I think when you talk about a narrative campaign, it's like mostly that, but there's still sandbox elements and vice versa. I just think that's something important. I just wanted to bring up ahead of time. But definitely there is sandbox games, which I think West March is like a classic one, right? West March style, that's a classic one. And narrative-driven campaigns would be like most published games, right, would be considered a narrative campaign. I think, Savage Worlds, we have a lot of what they call plot points that mean to be a little bit more flexible, like mean to have that sandbox bleed in. But if you think of like classic D&D, most of those are going to be like narrative driven ones, like the dragon. What we were just talking about it, Chris, like the dragon journey, whatever.
Horde of the Dragon
Horde
Queen?
of the Dragon, Queen, or whatever.
I think, when I think of sandbox, I think of it as it's really something where it's the world is just kind of laid out for the players to explore, and there's a little bit of their own motivation into it. It's like, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? What do you want to explore? And then the game master reacts to it. Versus, again, narrative driven is really there's a meta arc idea that the GM has brought to now they're going to modify it and change it, and they're not going to railroad anybody. I get it, but it's really there's some kind of meta story that's there that the players are shaping the world around that. But in the end of the day, it wasn't all them just going someplace and having this emergent narrative happen. So that's kind of how I look at the differences between them.
I think ultimately we can reduce it down to, sandbox is generally the GM reacting to players, and narrative is generally players reacting to the game master, like story wise. I think that is the easiest, like the most reductive we can be, right?
I like that.
Carl, that's kind of what you were saying.
Yeah, get that down to a couple of sentences, and episode's over. Thank you, everybody, for. So, all right, hey. So now that we've talked a little bit about what they are, and we talked a little bit about the differences already, but let's kind of dive into that. What really makes them different? What really kind of defines each of these? I don't know. I'll call it a genre. Maybe that's not the right word for it, but play styles. So. Let's talk about sandbox first, and kind of what's the elements that go into kind of a sandbox campaign, world, adventure. Eric, I'll kick it to you first.
I mean, like you said before, it's very player driven, right? And what do we mean by that? Is that the narrative will generally follow what the players decide. It also will often follow their interests more. So that's like the strength of Sandbox is, the players will naturally kind of what they want to do is where they will gravitate towards. So you're just kind of getting that as part of that game, right? Is the interest of the player is being highlighted because they're the ones kind of manning the ship.
Right.
It's also the player-driven part. It's also much easier to get players invested in a sandbox game. Generally, right? Not all the time. It really depends on a lot of factors, but because they're deciding where to go, they just will naturally feel that there's more ownership. So that's another kind of part of that player-driven part. I also think it is much easier to use, like when we talked before about kind of chopping up pre-published adventures. It's kind of generally easier to use the small APs, like the ones that are not like the main, big games, but the ones that are just like one shot. It's much easier to integrate those into a sandbox too. I think that's another strength of a sandbox, is that it's much easier to kind of take the smaller stories and just shove them in because, you're like, okay, this one fits where they're wanting to go here, so I'm just going to use this one and kind of modify it. So that's another way. Yeah.
In the old school adventures, that was very much the modules. Everything was in Greyhawk, but you could kind of slot the modules in depending on where the players went and what you wanted. So yeah, for sure, it's easier to kind of take those one shots and integrate them. So yeah, keep going.
No, we can.
Okay, one of the things that I think I mentioned as the story emerges organically, because there could be multiple threads, a lot of things working in parallel. Players went here, then players went there. You're not necessarily trying to have that one single thing weaving through everything. It could be completely different, it's separate and not related, but the players have decided that this is an interesting thread to pull on versus something else, and you let them pull on that thread and you forget the other one and you move on with this one.
I feel just like on this is the really classic, like an NPC that you maybe just came up with on the fly or didn't think much about can either become like a favorite or an enemy of the players, and you could just that can drive like a bunch of sessions, right? An enemy that they just an NPC that just rubbed them the wrong way, and it just became a multi-session adventure based on this NPC.
Chris, so are there anything else related to sandboxes that you think make them that's like a particular difference or strength of them?
I do think they're a lot easier, like we've already said, to work things into, especially things that you've come across as you're playing. Like I just saw a live stream or I read a thing and now I want to work it into my story. That didn't have to be as much prep because you can just kind of find a way to work it in. So it's much more like malleable as time passes, I suppose. But I think we've hit all the big points of them, though.
Yeah. I like what you said there because you get a cool idea from a podcast that you listen to all the time. You can slot it in. So
yeah.
While you're using their cool stuff on. So anyway, there you go. And so let's talk about narrative.
I have some more just real quick.
Oh, do you? Go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think to say about Sandbox is that I have found, this is my opinion, but there's much less prep session to session because you are kind of reacting and it's more... I don't think we even said it's more improv based, right? It's more you have to become on the fly with stuff. So there's much less prep session in the session. But usually, if this is like a homebrew sandbox, you usually are doing much more pre-planning as far as before the campaign starts, because you want to get your world down, right? You want to get your main kind of factions down. You want to have all that stuff built up because you're just letting the players go. It's kind of like building a sandbox, right? You need to make sure that sandbox is safe, it's well constructed, there's all the sand in it, you have all the toys in the sandbox, right? It's a lot more pre-planning as far as creating the sandbox, but then you just let the kids go, right? You're not worried about what it is. When we take and then we'll talk about the other one. Also, I think sandboxes, a strength of them is that it's much easier to adjust to a variable party, which I mean that if you have a bunch of people that drop out a lot, or people come in, like I can only play once in a while, a sandbox is much more flexible and resilient to handle variable party sizes like that than a narrative one. Because usually a narrative one, you've kind of keyed in, the kind of stories for these characters and the story beats and, all the encounter balance ahead of time. So sandboxes just can handle that much better.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that kind of flipped the script a little bit, when you talked about a lot of pre-planning, it depends. That depends a little bit if your sandbox is a classic, the world is unknown and you're exploring it. You need to plan the areas around there and understand what those look like. But you still can get away with having the big world a little more of a mystery and not do all the world building that you need to do. But again, it depends. If there's a possibility of the players to go from one continent to another continent in a session. Yeah, you got to kind of understand what the pieces of your world are, for sure.
That's why I think generally Sandbox games usually are being used like with a published setting, like not adventure, but they often people use published settings already because there's so much world building already done, right? That's what at least I found.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Now, what about the narrative side of it? We'll kick it to, I think we did Chris. Now let's kick it to Eric first on the narrative side.
No, Chris, I did enough in that.
All right, Chris, go ahead.
Chris talk.
So narrative stuff. This my big thing for narrative stuff, which I actually get from the players, is that a lot of times they don't want to think a lot. Maybe because this is their hobby and they're not at work and they don't want to have to like do a lot of, well, I don't know where to go or I don't know what we're supposed to be doing. And the narrative ones seem to like help drive that, much better through the story, through the intended story beats and the plot points and the encounters and stuff. And you kind of have a good sense of you're headed toward the vampire at the castle at the end or whatever it is. And it's not so like trying to find the point of it all amongst the things. So that is the big reason we typically play them. As there's a lot easier setup for the GM, which we've just gone over. They already know the lore and the history and the setup and the maps. These are all things that are done for you. So the prepping for it is so much less work. So I like them because I'm very busy. So I often choose pre-done adventures like this.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I want to build on something you said about. I think it's a good point to make as far as player experience. I think narrative games are just building on what you said. Narrative games are much better for players who are inexperienced. And I think generally, again, sandbox games are more successful with experienced players because they know kind of where to go and how to do things and that kind of stuff, and they have a grasp of the mechanics better, right? What new players might be more overwhelmed if they have all these choices plus all the like mechanics side. So I think that's a good one, and I think with narrative too, we made Chris as a good point. We also need to, it's not always pre-published narrative. I do narrative stuff, very heavy narrative, and it's just completely homebrew. So it's not always. Not a pushback, but just kind of as a counterpoint to what you said, Chris, as far as prepping. Counterpoint to what I said about the sandbox, I think there's more prep per session in narrative if you're not doing it all ahead of time, because you are prepping. You know what you want to do, and so you're kind of, you don't have to do all the prepping at the start of the game, but you kind of have the main story beats down. So, okay, I need to work on this map that I know they're going to, right? And on this map ahead of time. So there's more prep per session, but you can get away with less pre-planning. In comparison to the sandbox games, where because you are not necessarily railroading, but because you know that you are isolating them to this kind of maybe this continent or this country or this city, right? Because you know that like the story is going to take them in this direction, you don't have to do as many of that pre-planning like I talked about sandbox, where you have to build out everything on a meta level, but you have to do more prep per session often because you're doing these larger maps and you are just doing stuff ahead of time. So that's
Well, I think
I agree with that.
I think one of the things that it also allows you to do, and this plays off of what you're saying about prepping per session, it gives you a chance to have easier, the sandbox can do this well, but it's easier to have kind of those big moments, those big set piece adventures that, that this is the culmination of a big side adventure that then leads to the main adventure and has some impact there. But you can build those set pieces out in advance. It's a little harder unless, from a sandbox you're building and you go, oh, this really is something that should happen. So the next thing they find is going to be this thing. But if they go the other way, well, then, okay, maybe it's a little harder to do that because they went and picked up this other thread. So it's definitely easier to have those big set pieces in advance. And if you've got a lot of Dwarven Forge, you're going to want to be able to set your big set pieces up in advance. So, and there's probably a lot more narrative stuff out there as far as being able to watch it, learn about it, see other people play. They're not really generally doing things like a sandbox, kind of adventure, right?
Yeah, I think it's generally, when we talk about experience, I think it's easier for both game masters and players who are more inexperienced or even experienced ones to do narrative like that to do narrative well. I think, you can do sandbox, but it might not be successful. I think there's a lot more challenges with sandbox. So narrative is just generally an easier one to kind of work with, whether it's a published or homebrew. I also want to say, I think it's on top of what you were saying, Carl, as far as set pieces, it's also easier to incorporate like interesting twists and surprises with narrative because you are kind of pre-planning stuff. You can, when you're not kind of reacting maybe as much in the moment or reacting like that week, you can kind of plan for those really big twists, like we've talked about in other episodes, and really big surprises and twists, like and betrayals and things like that, right? You can kind of plan those out ahead of time much more easier with narratives.
Very cool. Very cool. So that's the differences, right? So so each one has a different flavor, different flair. Each has their goods and bads. What kind of challenges does each one have? And is that, you go back to Eric where you said that there's a mix, right? Nothing is exactly the same. And so how do you mix these two ingredients together to kind of get what you want? So from a Sandbox standpoint, kind of what is the challenges? And I think we hit upon some of the things that the narrative world does. The Sandbox, you need like Eric, you said, you need to have a deep understanding of the world. You don't necessarily have to have everything, all the world building done, but to go back to what you said about pre-planning, there's a lot more work that has to be done so that, again, if the players decide to go one way, you at least know what's over there. You at least know what's interesting. Unless you're doing something that's all randomized, but that's probably a different episode altogether. And the other thing that I think is really, really big is you need to be a good improviser. Some may disagree, and this is an opinion, but if you're really going to allow the players do whatever they want and just follow their lead, you got to have a little bit of chops to make things up on the fly, because you don't have a chance to do all the prep you might want to, and within a session, two different things could happen than you might have thought were going to happen, and you need to roll with those punches. But there's plenty others, right? So what do you guys think are some of the challenges?
If we're going with from either one, so to me, when I do like a sandbox thing that I'm creating, I have this real issue with, I need to know everything about the world before we even start, because what am I going to do if a player asks me who the god of death is or whatever, and I'm like, I don't know. So I'm just saying the challenge of this, I think, is having an ability to come up with information on the fly is maybe if it's a giant sandbox, that something like a skill that might be helpful. And then the flip side is, if you aren't going to do that, there's a lot of stuff you got to do ahead of time if you are that detail oriented like I am. So that to me is like the big thing for Sandbox. I consider them having a ton of work because I want to know everything up front.
Yeah, and that really highlights what I was talking about as far as like the prepping per session versus the pre-planning of, like, because I'm the same way, Chris. Like because I do homebrew stuff, it's like I need to write a lot. Like I need to write out a lot of stuff. Kind of like a fantasy writer, right? Who like will often build out their world first and then kind of write the story within that. I think another big problem with Sandbox, and like we kind of touched on this, is that it can feel really shallow, or it can feel very like things can get away from you on one part. Things can just get completely away from you and just not be in a good place, or things can just feel very like not fulfilling, or like I said, scattered, because you're just going in too many directions. There's just not good hooks that have been done, and things can stall out. So I think sandboxes can really have that problem of just kind of petering out, or feeling kind of wide but short, or wide but shallow, right? Like I think there's some quote in that of like, right, of like a, I don't know, like a lake that being wide, right, and only 2 inches deep.
Like skills. They talk about like expertise. There's people who have
exactly
know a lot about a little, and there's people who know a little about a lot. So
which is kind of also kind of sums up the differences.
Yeah.
And I think also with Sandbox, again, this goes back to experience. You're just relying on players a lot more for a lot of things. Carl, you want to talk about
I was just jumping in. You're saying exactly what I was going to say. It's all about player motivation, right? The players have to... And I thought this kind of... You were playing on this with the petering out. The players have to be motivated to make the story work and drive it and build out that narrative. And if they're just kind of sitting back waiting for stuff to happen, then things are going to feel shallow. It's going to be all over the place, and you'll be like leading them by the nose, and in that case, you're doing a narrative plot anyway, right? So So sorry I stepped on you there, but yeah, that's
No,
totally
that was perfect.
it's totally
That
there.
was fine.
Yeah.
I mean, another challenge I think is like, I think we talked about it before, is like the lack of set pieces. Like, it is much harder to make interesting combat that doesn't feel stale, and interesting encounters that don't feel stale and kind of one note. I mean, there's just a lot more. Again, if you have time to prep week to week, you know that they're going towards something, right? You know that you are going towards something, so you have times to prep that. But still, it can be much more challenging to come up with those interesting encounters. And a lot of this also depends on systems, right? If systems are more mechanically complex, then it's going to be, in my opinion, like narrative games work better with Sandbox, right? And crunchy games generally work better for me, at least on the narrative side a bit, when we're talking about like complexity of encounters. Because when you have a lot of abilities and stuff, and you have a lot of different stuff coming in, it's hard to keep track of it all, right? Carl, we've talked a lot about, and Chris too, in this series about, you kind of have to act when players make mechanical decisions for their players, either good or bad, like Savage Worlds, like hindrances, or they take certain edges or feats, right? You want to kind of react off of that to like make it worth it. So if they have water breathing ability that they took, you want to make sure you include some type of water thing where it feels, I feel good that I took this water breathing because I'm using it. And that is just going to be much harder to make that feel fulfilling on a Sandbox game versus a narrative game where you can plan it out. And for games like Powered by the Apocalypse, like Monster Hearts or something or whatever, the Sandbox can be a much more interesting thing because you don't have to worry about this kind of mechanical complexity. It is already a role-playing game, so it just is easier that way, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what about the narrative side? So Sandbox has got challenges. Narrative's got a whole set of challenges and lots of episodes. But what are some of the kind of the critical few as it compares to a Sandbox?
I think Eric said one earlier that was if you have a diverse party or a very unique party, it's a little harder to fit them sometimes into wherever your narrative linear thing is going. Like, you can't really make it work for these specific players that are oddly built as easily, at least, as the Sandbox thing is. Because maybe this was a very combat-oriented narrative, and this person is a supernatural investigator or something, and they're thinking they're not getting used a lot. Yeah.
Or they're going into like it's based around this like human authoritative state, and they've all made like tieflings and and weird swamp goblins or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Swamp Goblins. That's a really great band. You guys
That's
should listen
the
to
best
them
kind.
more. Anyway,
That's our side project.
That's a side project. Yeah. Look for it on Spotify. Anyway,
I just spot that domain there.
Yeah, check on that. So anyway, so one of the things I think is the big one, though, or one of the big ones is player agency. It's if your narrative is too narrowly focused and you really have like this one set of things to go down. Now it really does feel like railroading. It's not. They don't have natural ability to go wherever they want or feel like they're going where they want to go and doing things that they want to do because you've got a meta narrative and you've got to keep it moving, and so you got to keep them kind of keep funneling down the right direction. Keeping player agency, which we've talked about a million times. Making sure that players feel like they are in control is a little more challenging if you've got a story that you're trying to tell or you're not prepared to adjust the story based on the players' actions or reactions to the things that you're offering up. So that's one that I think is a big one.
Yeah, those are huge. That's a huge one. My other really big one, I think, for narrative ones, is it's much easier to work yourself into corners narratively. Obviously, in a narrative game. I mean, we've talked about this before in other episodes, but like where you kind of have like pass-fail encounters where like, okay, what do I do if they fail this? Or like, I kind of, I've written them into a corner, like literally, like I don't know where to go from this because they chose this or they failed this. And you can kind of overdo it with your planning or if there's an AP or whatever. And like we were talking about the Horde of the Dragon, I can't remember the name of it, but you know what I'm talking about, Chris does. And Horde of the Dragon Queen.
Yep.
There's like a famous part of that where you can get a party kill in the beginning of that. And if you follow that, like you can kill the party off, right? It's kind of a famous hiccup of that setting of that AP. So I think it's just narratives are just much easier to kind of work yourself, and you have a lot less flexibility as far as throwing throwing them a Hail Mary to get them out of a situation, right? Because you've already structured it so much going this direction. So that's a big one for me.
Yeah, and I think we talked about our favorite published adventures. I think that's probably true of a lot of published adventures, right? Because it's a story arc. So the assumption is the thing before this next thing you've completed successfully somehow. And like you said, there's a very famous ETU has a very famous thing too, where I think if the gym doesn't blow up or something along those lines, the next thing doesn't happen. And I'm trying to remember back to that plot.
It kind of
point
falls
campaign.
apart.
Yeah, it falls apart.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm rewatching Babylon 5, which is, it's amazing how prescient that is right now with everything going on in the world. But, that is a very pre-planned, heavily narrative show, right? Like unlike a lot of so many shows, like the guy who wrote that show had like a very clear idea for where the story was going. And we can relate that to games. Like I have that problem now in my game where we'll talk about it later, but there's a lot of narrative parts in it. But if a player doesn't show up to that, I kind of like, well, I kind of need them here, right? So in that show, that person had this, this plan, but he wrote in, I forgot his name, JMS or it's Michael, whatever.
Yeah, JMS.
He wrote in these, like, I think they called them trapdoors, right? Like it's famous because in the first season, the main character has to leave for health issues. But for every character, he wanted to make sure that it wasn't just if an actor had to go, the show didn't fall apart. So, like that's another one that with problems with narratives, if you have that strict storyline and you don't have players showing up, or player has to leave for a couple months, or a player leaves the game, that also is a real big problem, right? Is kind of hung up. So that's just that reminded me of that, Carl.
Oh yeah. He's. That was a very famous thing that was new to kind of television. You've got shows like Lost, where they're just making it up as they go along, and nothing comes together. And then you had Babylon 5, where he had this 5-year story, which the network only gave him 4 years to do because they were about to cancel the show. So he tied up all the loose ends in like the 4th season, and then they said, "Oh, psych, we're giving you a 5th season." and the 5th season of the show just kind of fell apart, and it wasn't as good as the.
But he had those trapdoors for like the main character came in, another character left, he had somebody. It was like a really smart thing to do. But we can talk about that in the tips.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of tips, so we talked about a lot of challenges and a lot of interesting things, and what's the difference between them. But what about some tips? This is a tip show, right? So, what about some tips that we could bring to the table for each of these ideas, like Sandbox and narrative? And we started with the Sandbox every time, so let's start with narrative this time. So who's got some great tips on overcoming some of those challenges as it relates to the counterpoint that is the Sandbox? Chris, do you want to throw anything out to start with?
Sure. I like our note here on the Quantum Ogre and how that comes into play.
Quantum Ogre. Yep.
Yeah, I've been waiting for that to appear in this conversation. But this is like, you only have so much prep time, and you need to use something. There is, benefits of this. If you went left or right, you're still going to this encounter. Not that they need to know that, but reusing things is okay. You're the only one maybe that's even going to know. But I do like so that there's a writing tip in like fiction writing or maybe nonfiction writing. I don't know. But if you don't use something, you save it, you cut it out of your story, you save it for later, and you put it in a little file or something. So to me, this is the same type of thing. It's like you already have certain encounters or things designed, so you may as well use them.
Yeah, and even on top of that, like even if it's not something where you always had them like, okay, you guys can go left or right here, and whatever they always were going to face the ogre no matter what. Like it's not like you can just plan that ahead of time, so that's a good one.
Well, I would only caution the Quantum Ogre is usually used as a cautionary tale as opposed to it's the right thing to do in every situation. Sometimes a choice has consequences that mean that something doesn't happen, and you as a game master, going back to what Chris said, you can take that and just put it on your shelf.
Yeah,
and it may be useful at a later date. But it's not useful anymore. So I'm just a little.
No, that's a good point.
I
guess I just meant that it's a tool to use not all the time, but sparingly of like the illusion of choice. If you are relying on a very heavily narrative thing, and that's what you're going for, that you can still put in. And there could be differences, but you can still kind of put in at times the illusion of choice to give players the feeling that they have. It's not as railroaded, even though it might be. right? That's all I meant. It's a tool to be used in part of your toolbox.
It's only cautionary if they know you did it.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly. 100%. There we go, Chris. That's the quote of the episode for sure. I think another big tip for me here is that when you're doing a narrative one, that you really, 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 really want to incorporate in even more so than Sandbox. You want to make you want to have the character backgrounds made, and you really, really want to make quests based on those, because again, they can still be narrative style, right? Where okay, we're going to this, we're going to do the character quest, so that'll be the next 5 sessions we'll be dealing with this character's background. But, so it still is that narrative style of you prepping a lot and you kind of having the, walls or whatever, or illusory walls, but just take, the character quests become much more important, because that will, while the characters might not have as much freedom, and that's where they're getting out of it, they're getting out of it because their character stories are being explored, right? That makes sense. So I just think it's much more important for narrative games to explore the character backstories, to make room for that, fitting within the AP or fitting within the story. Obviously, you can do that with Sandbox games. I just think that it's important to write those in and really explore them in depth. Compared to Sandbox.
That makes a lot of sense. And then, one thing you mentioned, I see in the notes, and I think, that role-playing aspect of it, giving people role-playing breaks, because I'm guilty of when I have a narrative, very often we're like, oh, you've completed this thing, great job, way to go. Oh, by the way, here's this next thing that happens that's reacting to what you've done, but I don't sometimes give you guys a chance to kind of sit down and digest and, absorb what happened and make some choices and decide what you're going to do, because the next thing comes up so fast. So, allow for those role-playing, downtime, that sort of thing to make it, giving them chances to explore and do things they want to do during downtime gives them a sense that the world is more than just a story after story after story after story.
Yeah. And I have the same problem, Carl. I can, in the narrative ones, because I just will get hung up on, okay, I want to reach this beat. I want to reach this beat. And you really, really have to stop yourself at times and allow kind of the story to breathe, I guess, and the party to breathe. And okay, let's let them, just, even if they want to just talk amongst themselves, even if it's not, I don't need to get to each beat so quickly. We can take a break here. So that is, really important.
Yeah, I think those are kind of like a rest stop on the freeway, right? You can kind of pull off for a little bit and then get back on.
So what about Sandbox?
Well, I still have more for narrative.
Do you?
Chris,
Okay,
if you have any more for narrative? Or
No, I'm good for narrative.
Another one that's kind of similar to allowing the breaks is checking with players more. And what I mean by that is hey, how's the game going, right? Because if you are going off in a narrative way, in a certain direction for a while, and the players, it's not jiving for the players, that's a bigger problem than Sandbox, right? Because again, the Sandbox is kind of, it's kind of doing its own thing based on the players' whims. So you don't really need to check in that way as much. You should still check in every once in a while. But what I mean is you're checking in hey, are you guys liking the direction the game is going? Are we happy with it? It's just important to have those times where you check in that way. Also, I would say, sorry,
let me build on that real quick.
Yeah, build on it.
Since we are doing narrative, and they say, no, I don't like how this is going, but this is a pre-written narrative. What's the answer there?
I guess for me, I was more talking about homebrew narratives in this way.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that is a good point to make the distinction, because within the narrative space, we do have the pre-published and we do have homebrew, right? Which are different. I mean, we could have almost had an episode on that, right? Of separating those out, but we're not. But that is a good point, Chris. I think I meant that with homebrew narrative.
But you need to avoid the sunk cost fallacy in role playing games. I mean, if people aren't having
100%.
fun with a published adventure, I mean, you can pull the plug.
Move on. There you go.
There's so many pre-published
that's the
adventures
answer.
to say. This just
And if
isn't
you want to
fun.
if they want to keep the characters, come up with a weird portal. They're getting sent to a different. I don't know. Maybe not. But that is the good answer to your question, Chris. I think is avoid the sunken cost fallacy. One more I want to talk about is because you're doing narrative, really lead into out of combat encounters. I think. While you can do that on the fly as far as with Sandbox, The narrative ones, again, you can really add more you have space to add in the more complex social stuff, or something in Savage Worlds, dramatic tasks, right? Like you can add in more interesting twists. I mean, of course, I do random dramatic tasks. Like we just had one in my campaign where I kind of had the thought ahead of time that it was going to go this direction, but I didn't know it would go this way. That one of the characters in a and this kind of last minute comment that I had to put in because somebody was gone, where they were fighting a swamp troll and his pet gators, and one of the characters has Beast Friend. This is Savage Worlds, has Beast Friend, and took over the alligators. And I'm like, I know this guy, and he's gonna want these as pets on the ship. I just already knew it. So eventually, that's what was happening, and then I had to come up with like a dramatic task on the fly. But I did plan ahead of time. It was like, okay, how can I make this dramatic attack more interesting, right? Because I know that's what it's going to be. So you can just build in, just lean on more out of combat stuff because that's just easier to do with narrative, and it will mix it up more, right? If that makes sense.
Yep, makes total sense. So any other thoughts from ideas on the narrative side? So what about a sandbox? So sandbox is interesting because I think there's probably people talk a lot about narrative and, game master tips for narrative adventures and stuff. But what about a sandbox? Mm-hmm. Sandbox is an interesting beast in and of itself. So what are some thoughts along those lines? I think, one of the big ones I think that I'll personally throw out there is that, you lean heavily on the players' input as they're doing things. And we just had an episode on world building and taking advantage of the characters' input. As they're doing things, let them take on some of the work to fill in the framework, because again, you've prepped the world, but very few people have time to prep down to the last detail, and that's where the players can add those details and make it look fun for them because they went to this direction. They went here, so what does this thing look like, and why is it there, and what do you see, and those sorts of things is a great way of making the sandbox a little easier to handle from a game master standpoint. It's not all on your shoulders, lever the players. That's one that I think is a big one. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
What other ones do you think are out there?
That was my big one.
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit on top of that, like you were saying, Carl, it's especially this is more again for homebrew sandboxes versus a presetting, but you can do it in both. But like Chris was saying, the person that's detail or wanting that all built out, that's a lot of work. So again, heavily, it's so important, Carl. What you said is like you really want to rely on them to do that. And when you go to these regions, if you need more, then you're like, hey, Joe, like what's the deal with the religion here? Like, it's not written, but you're the one doing it, so it kind of takes some of that load off of you for sure.
Yeah, I think it's important to know, if you how much control you really think you need. Like, can you just do the sketch, or do you need to ink the lines? Can the players fill in the color? It's just like you can always start with the skeletal structure and just let them build without losing any of your kind of predetermined things you wanted to happen.
Yeah, cool.
That's really true. Another big tip for me is you should definitely pre-set up battle maps and encounters that are more flexible. Not these big what do you call them? Set pieces, right? Like we talked about, but pre-set up some basic desert battle map or city battle map or tavern. Just have these generic maps created. If you're in real life, just have them. I don't know. Have the notes done out, but if you're in a digital space, then you can have them made. Just set up the stuff ahead of time, so when you do just have a random encounter or you need to pull out something, it's taking up some of the time of okay, I need to stop for a second. And if you're doing that constantly in a sandbox game, it really will get bogged down because you're just going to have so much more of this improv in a sandbox game. So it's good to have your basic stuff just already kind of set up at least. So just flexible maps, flexible encounters that are already kind of pre-generated. Again, that's why I think sandbox games take a lot more pre-planning versus session to session.
Or maybe think about theater of the mind. Maybe there's more need for that in a sandbox type thing. One of the things we mentioned in our holiday gift guide was a random table book. So random tables can be a big friend for you. Random tables, anything from random what you see in a city to random when you run into an NPC out in the wilderness. Are they friendly, not friendly? What do they look like? Random tables can be a huge benefit to you these books of random tables. So leverage some of the brain power of other people and take advantage of sort of their ideas to help you improvise.
Yeah. On top of that, I think it's important to have your book on you. Have all your favorite generator links there, right? Like have it all set up so you don't have to like find it. Like that's really important for a sandbox game, is just have that stuff easy to go to. Another one was Chris. Do you want to talk about something?
No, I just would add on to that, as I have a book from, I think it's pronounced Loki Battle Maps, that has all of these generic taverns and blah, blah,
nice.
blah maps. And it's very, very handy.
I think also in the last episode we talked about it, is you really, really want to heavily incentivize players here for taking notes in different capacity. Like more so than a narrative game, I think you really, really want to lean on a player, one player being the note taker for certain things, one player being the one that handles the inventory. Like because you're going to have more stuff to manage on the fly and take notes as far as like the world goes as a game master, you want to have a lot of the players taking up some of that slack on a sandbox game. So really come up with ways to incentivize players as far as of taking these roles up. I think the classic one for Savage Worlds, like in my game, is the note taker gets an extra penny per session. Right, it's just really easy. The person who takes the most notes gets an extra penny. Just because, like in a narrative game, right, you might not have to take as much notes because you have the stuff already set up. So Sandbox, you really want to lean on that.
Very cool. Very cool. So there's a little bit of ideas for both, but I think as we start looking at kind of the last part of the show, Eric hit it right on the head when he started the episode saying everything's a hybrid. So most campaigns aren't one or the other, and they're a little mix of each, and it depends on kind of the flavor you're trying to get, how far you go one way or the other. You still can have set pieces with a open world where people are exploring, but kind of where things are on the map, and they're going to hit them in a certain place at a certain time.
Yeah.
They're all the way to, it's a 50-50 match. There's parts of it which are overland crawls, and then they get to, or point, they get to a point where they've reached something that now has some pre-planned adventures. So everything is kind of a mix. So I think there's kind of different approaches or different styles. Maybe you guys.
Yeah, these are just like the names that I came up with. I didn't look at it. These are just my own personal names. But
all right, well, you expand on them. So I don't know ladder styles.
I mean, these are what I call them. But as far as the different kind of percentage breaks, what I generally rely on is what I call a ladder style, which kind of it's by rungs as far as how the percentages switch. So like in my game now, I started very, very heavily narrative, like almost completely narrative. And then as they get to kind of different checkpoints or different, goals, like each rung kind of opens it up to being more open world, right? And then it will switch to a much more open style game. So we start, I guess you could also think of this as like a cone where you're starting more narrow and then it's just getting wider as you go. But I just think of it as a ladder of each rung kind of opens it up. Another one that I've used is called what I call zone style, which basically that you have, your big open map, but then you have like, once the players decide to go somewhere or handle something, then they're kind of locked in for a good amount of time into a more narrative focused game. So this is just, it's not like progressing to be more open. It's just they kind of skip around to more narrative, more focused areas, right? Finally, I have one called wave style, where it's kind of like, it comes in waves as far as like you kind of have the placid sea, right? And then a wave comes, and that's kind of a shorter, tighter quest in between the open areas. So the zone style is more like you're going to a certain place and you're really kind of investing a lot more time into that, where the wave style is more like, you're going between an open world. And I think that's what most kind of most sandbox games, I keep saying open world, most sandbox games are kind of the wave style, in my opinion, where they're going to different areas, and then you have your like maybe smaller quests or maybe smaller kind of narrative ideas in each of these areas. It's not as big as, say, the zone style. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys. If you guys have other ways that you kind of think about this, I don't know, Chris, do you have any ideas on this, or am I making sense at all?
I mean, some of what you say makes sense. Yes.
Some.
Okay. No, I agree with these different styles and stuff. Some of it reminds me of the old World of Warcraft thing where they had, I can't remember what the feature was called, but the actual landscape of the game would change once you did certain things. Like you would see a castle that was built, but once a certain event passed for your character, it would be in ruins, but other people would see it the other way. It was like you went through a different phase. Maybe phases is what they called it. But some of these remind me of that like, and it's very kind of also tied into the plot point campaigns that Savage Worlds does, that there are a lot of key events or encounters that are going to happen, and what you do up until that point isn't as important as long as we know that once these main beats happen, the world is different and there are different things going about. And I think that most of these are almost like a variation of that, but they're all, like you said, they're all very blurry. You know, it's like, it's just a little bit more percentage of one way or the other, either way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know as far as the ladder style, zone style, wave style. Sounds very much like martial arts. You know, are you following the ladder style? Yeah.
It's a guy fighting on a ladder.
Yeah, ladder style. But
I meant it just to illuminate like the way that you chop.
No. I'm not teasing you at all.
No.
I think I think it's interesting that it really comes down to when all of these styles they're basically what chunk of time as the player really have complete control over the direction. And then if they have more complete control and it only comes when they get someplace or they hit some triggering, there's an adventure. Well, that's closer to fully Sandbox, because the adventures, like we said before, it could be a one shot. It could be like a couple of narrative story points, which is, I feel like, kind of your wave style, versus, which I really like the idea of, we start off very narratively until the players get a feel of the world. They know what the world's about. They start wanting to explore their backstories, because a lot of people write backstories that are like, all the cool stuff's happened before I kind of existed. Or they have, I've got this arch enemy, and it's not really that important initially, but it's going to be important later. Well, then that's when you start opening it up to them driving their own motivations, and they may decide, I want to go find this guy, and so I'm going to start traveling this direction, and we didn't know that that's the direction you'd want to take, and so we start building adventures around that with the plot point concept of there's going to be events that happen. So in the early stages, these events happen, then it's like open, and so that's more of your ladder style kind of way of handling thing. And then, of course, you give the players lots of choices and options, and that can make a more narrative world feel like a more of a sandbox world, because there's lots of choices for them to make, and they may all lead to the same end result, kind of like in a mystery, right? In an actual mystery adventure, there may be 5 different places they can go, but they could get clues in each spot that leads them to another spot that ultimately solves the adventure. So it's the same sort of thing that you can kind of think of, I think.
Yeah, just to illuminate, like, I think the ladder style is what, if you're going to do an open world sandbox type game, you should still most of the time build it out that way. Again, especially if you have less experienced players, it's better to let them get especially if it's like a new world too that they're not used to, right? It's better to do it that way to kind of get them introduced. Like, so in my game, I started the players out on very, very scripted, like, you guys all have to come up with a reason to be on the ship or to be part of this organization. Then they're going through and things are just kind of happening to them. And then I kind of have like little open areas within that, but they're just kind of very, focused. And then they got to, so that happened. There was like all these kind of like in the beginning of a video game when you have all these like cutscenes happening and, you just have stuff going and you're getting used to the world that way. And then they got to this one island where there was there was a goal in this one island, but they could have approached it in a lot of different ways. This was a smaller island, but there was a lot of kind of stuff they could tackle. Again, all getting to the same kind of point, but like, it was contained, but it was more open. And now once they're leaving this island, that's when it's truly going to get to the open world part of the kind of the Caribbean, basically, where there's a lot of stuff that can go in a lot of directions. So I think generally when you're doing a hybrid type of game or even just doing a sandbox game, you should still, that's why we said most games are a mix. You should start with kind of, a mix and start with a more narrative focus.
All right, cool. Any other thoughts on hybrids?
There's a lot more notes in there, so.
Well, I don't know.
Chris, do you have anything extra on that?
Well, it feels like we've explored a lot of that. But Chris, jump on in.
Okay.
So.
I just wanted to reiterate something that I think Eric said earlier, is that the comparison to, like, if you're reacting to the player or reacting to the GM, whoever it was that said that, I think that is still the key here. Like
Yeah.
in moving between these things, it's like how much percentage are you reacting to what you're told from the players, and how much of the players reacting from the GM.
Very cool. Very cool. So I guess that's leave a lot of space for the characters to explore their motivations, leave room for side quests in a narrative game that they choose. I think that's kind of what I was getting to before. Is, give them an opportunity to push the narrative, even if you've got an overall meta narrative that you're trying to, trying to share with them. I say share as opposed to guide them through it because, you have to be willing to completely change your storyline based on what the players do. But that's a whole other episode in and of itself, which I think we've talked about before. So,
I think like on the hybrid thing, I think it's just like if you're doing an AP, it's just like deciding, okay, I want to put in more open world sections in it, right? Like, and that's what we've talked about in this episode already. If you're doing a homebrew campaign, then you just got to think. The first thing you got to think about is what kind of game it is, and like what percentage of narrative versus open world or sandbox do I want it to be. And then, like I said, there's those different styles. But however you want to think about it, like that's just something to kind of introspectively touch on first. I think that's kind of the first thing that you kind of decide, right? Is even before the story or the narrative, it's like the style. Like, do I want to make this a completely narrative game? Do I want to make this a very sandbox game or some mix? And then you think, okay, how do I want to approach that mix? I think that's just the most important thing to kind of decide on when you're doing a homebrew game is that first, before you even think about maybe even the genre or the story, right? I mean,
sure.
You could think of like, okay, I want to do like a horror game, and then you think about that, whatever. You get what I'm saying?
No, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, you kind of need to know what you want to accomplish before you can start, layering in all the ideas on top of that, because that scaffolding is going to be what makes for a strong foundation of the game or not. So very cool. All right, gentlemen. Hey, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherepg.com to learn all about us and our projects. Please email gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com if you got a question, need some advice, anything, and we appreciate those emails. And thank you again for this email this week. That was fun to answer. And so if you like the show, and I hope you do, please help us with positive reviews on the sites of your choice, wherever you get your beautiful podcasts, wherever the podcasts are sold. And once again, I am Carl with Eric and Chris. Say goodbye, guys.
Goodbye. Have fun with your games.
Happy gaming.